I'm Bob Grove, and I'm speaking with David Hakin, Jack Alpert, Victor Dhougherty, and Alan Weisman about overpopulation. Population growth is declining, but obviously not fast enough to avoid a resource crisis. So are there moral, ethical ways to engage and encourage population control? David, you started talking about drawdown and how educating girls and family planning rates very high in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and controlling population. Can you talk more about that?
Yes, and there are a couple of points I want to make. One is that the topic of population also raises the troubling, often racist, classist, and coercive history of population control. And people's choices about how many children to have should always be theirs and theirs alone. But when we look at educating girls worldwide that are denied education, there are many barriers that we can just remove. Many girls are kept in the shop or the field as workers, even if their brothers go to school. And in many countries, there are no job opportunities for girls. And it's estimated there are 225 million young women who do not even have access to modern methods of contraception. And there are nearly 15 million girls worldwide each year that marry under the age of 18. So there are a lot of barriers that if we work on removing them and allow these young girls to get an education, that this helps their community, they give back, they're more productive, and it also has a huge impact on the future population and our chances of reversing global warming.
Alan, what's your thoughts on ethical moral population control?
Uh, the phrase population control went out in the 1980s when feminists uh, explained that control over women's body was a problem. Uh, in the 1980s, of course, that's when China had its one-child policy, and it was preceded by forced sterilization and forced vasectomies in India during the 1970s. We had had enough of that as a species. And interestingly, that coincided with the Islamic Revolution in Iran, which happened in 1979, after which they were immediately attacked by Iraq, who wanted this oil-rich province on their border. And they figured this is, these people are disorganized. Now's the time to go. And this is Saddam Hussein, who used to be a NATO ally, and we provided him with weapons, nerve gas, all of this stuff. All Iran had was bodies. So they threw them at the Iraqis, and they asked every fertile woman to do her patriotic duty to build a 20 million man army to defeat the Iraqis. At one point, they had the highest population growth rate in human history, 8 children per woman. But at the end of that, the economist who was the head of planning and budget in Iran went to the Ayatollah and he said, we have a big problem because when these kids grow up, we're not going to be able to employ all of them. And a nation full of frustrated, unemployed, angry young men is a destabilized nation. So the Ayatollah issued a fatwa saying there was nothing in the Quran that said you couldn't do any means, including getting an operation, if you wanted to just have the number of kids that you could responsibly care for. And having seen the Chinese policy, the Iranians told their population that people could have as many children as they wanted. They only had to go to premarital classes, either in a mosque or in a clinic, where they would learn, among other things, how much it costs to raise, feed, clothe, and educate a child. And they also encouraged women to stay in school, girls to stay in school, because when a girl gets out of school, she's got something interesting and economically useful to do with for her family. She can't do that with 7 kids. So this worked so well that their policy became the banner policy of family planning, not population control, family planning for the United Nations. Their population growth rates shrink down to replacement rate. That's two people produce two children. Therefore, population doesn't grow a year faster than China's one-child policy. Today in Iran, 60% of the women in the students in universities are female. But as Jack pointed out earlier, just replacement rate isn't good enough because we're already too many people on this planet for all the natural systems that support us. So we need to go below. Anything lower than two children is will shrink the population. If we tell people just one child like China did, they clench up. But if you allow them to, because things will stay the same, then a lot of them are going to have one or not even any, anyhow. And if you still want a big family, you can always adopt children. As one natural resource we're not running out of is children who need a home. So in my village, here, a little village I live in Massachusetts, the happiest family I know has 9 kids, 2 biological, 7 adopted.
Wow. Jack.
You got to remember, my number is 8 to 10 billion people. Almost everybody dies of starvation and conflict. So when you're talking about population control, I have to caveat this. I spent 30 years of my life as an engineer in dynamic systems theory, trying to figure out how many kids we needed to get the world balanced. I started with 1 kid per family, and I spent 15 years of research how to grow an infant that would come up with that conclusion without being told. So I'm sort of Mr. 1 kid per family and have been since the early 80s. Unfortunately, in about 8 years ago, I redid my calculations and I found out 2 bad ideas about having 1 child per family. The first one is that if we had 1 child per family, we wouldn't decrease fast enough to prevent this huge number of starvation and conflict deaths. And the second bug with 1 kid per family is that if the public ever got happy with 1 kid per family, and the Chinese public is right now happy with 1 kid per family, the population would go down to the sustainable value and then keep right on going. We'd disappear. So being successful at implementing 1 child per family isn't a long-term solution, and it isn't a good short-term solution. So the question is, what is the right number of kids to get the population down to not have 8 to 10 billion people die in the next 80 years from bad causes? And that turns out to be about 1 child per 140 women.
Wow.
If we had 1 child per 140 women for the next 50 years, then our population would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 100 million people in the year 2100. Now, in the next 80 years, you have to remember that the entire 7.8 billion people, I read this in your book last night, the entire 7.8 billion people, Alan's book, all of the people will be gone. By the time the 7.8 billion people that are alive today, the youngest one is going to be 80 years old and he's going to be dead. And the only people that are still going to be living in 2100 are the 80 cohorts that we grew between now and then. And that cohort, it's between 500,000 and 1 million kids per year. Now, there's something interesting about this control process, because as soon as you get to the 50th year and the cohort of fertile women is now down to 25 million people, every woman can have as many kids as she wants. You don't want them to culturally go to this 1 child per family. It isn't going to create a viable civilization. Think of it this way. Let's assume that the replacement value is 2 per woman, which is replacement. About a third of the women will have, in a developed society, about a third of the women will have 0 kids by choice or health. And their 2 permits are now up for grabs. The middle third will have 1 kid per family. So now we have 3 permits. We take those 3 and we drop them on the third third. They have to have an average of 5 kids per family. If they don't have 5 kids per family on average, then we're going to lose the first chair violinist in our symphony. We won't have enough to hold up a whole civilization. Now, if somebody in that group doesn't want 5, they want 4, another woman has to have 6. And for every woman that wants 3, another woman has to have 7. And for every woman who wants 2 kids, another has to have 8. So that once you get to a sustainable society, the number, instead of having the group decide how many kids should be born every year, 500,000, and limiting people, will be on the other side. The group will have to encourage women to have children because there's a very good chance that naturally we won't have enough children for replacement. And we'll have, a group will sweeten the pot for women to have children.
We're talking a lot about the numbers, reducing the numbers, but you know, it's a ratio between population and resources. We can also consider reducing our consumption per capita and addressing you know, population that way. I know the carbon footprint of a person living in India is 1.1, yet the carbon footprint per capita here in America is 16.1. We consume 16 times as much. You know, I live in a fairly conservative, average middle class house, but the carbon footprint of my house is larger than a small African village. So is it really a question of reducing population, or is it also a question of reducing consumption? Victor, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Thank you, Bob. I would, my knee-jerk response to that really is, it's of course a spiritual paradox, right? In other words, the answer is both and neither. And what I mean by that is, you know, when you take a page out of Dickens' story, The Christmas Carol, on the 2 little beings that came out from underneath the cloak of the ghost of Christmas present, the boy was ignorance and the girl was want. In other words, it's not so much about, on one hand, consumption or population control, it's about ignorance and want. And it's also, but it is also about those. So the reason why it's a paradox is because we're really dealing with this on 2 levels, the relative and the spiritual. Relatively, we need to do everything we can to help each other to try to work through and figure this out. On a spiritual level, you know, this is going to play out, and there's a naturalness to it that's going to play out.
Thank you. I'm Bob Grove, and we're talking about overpopulation. When we return, we'll continue this discussion and discuss, you know, resources versus population growth.